I met this gentleman about a year ago, having read one of his books, Black on Black Violence, and it had a profound effect on my thinking, and it's something that I think we all need to be exposed to. I won't get into what he will talk about, but simply say that, to me, having heard a lot of individuals who have tried to deal with issues, particularly those which affect young people and education, he's one of the few people that I think offers an excellent analysis, but more importantly, a correct analysis, not just an excellent one. Good intentions are wonderful, but if they don't produce the results, it does us no purpose. So without any further ado, I'd like to bring to you an elder, someone who I have a tremendous amount of respect for, and someone that I hope that after leaving here, you will not only purchase his book, but try to use this as a means of accessing further information about your culture, which means about yourself. So let me introduce to you right now, he doesn't like to be called doctor, but I call him that because sometimes people need to hear that to feel that this person is legitimate to speak to them. But we call him Brother Amos Wilson.
Thank you. Thank you very much, my good brother. Appreciate your invitation. I appreciate your coming here today, this afternoon. And of course, I know you are beginning to feel a bit that spring is in the air. And to come out here on a Saturday afternoon takes some doing, and I certainly appreciate your taking the time. Of course, I think the subject matter warrants the time as well. Death at an early age is the school system setting our children up for failure is the topic that was suggested to me today and to which I will speak for a bit. Is the school system setting our children up for failure? Very interesting question. Is the school system really has it ever set them up for anything else? It depends on how you measure failure and, of course, how you measure education. In my class at the College of New Rochelle at the campus here at Co-op City, I teach a course called Children at Risk. And during that course, we study an article from a very well-known book in the field called Regulating the Poor. That book describes how welfare policy in this country and how welfare policy historically has been used for political purposes, political and economic purposes. You know, if you hear people talk about welfare today, you would think that welfare was something that was invented in the United States and something that's principally utilized by African people or by Latino people. And we have built up such a mythology around welfare, the welfare mother, the welfare family, until it takes me a whole semester often just to knock out the myths surrounding the concept of welfare and what welfare is really about. There are many people, for instance, who still believe that there are more black people or Latino people on welfare than there are white people. And it's an amazing game as to how the political structure of this country operates on that myth. And they confused often percentages with absolute numbers. So if we would say that maybe 33 or a third of black people are on welfare and say maybe 15% of whites are on welfare, people confuse those two things. But when you're talking about 15% of whites, you're talking maybe about 9 million people, you see. As against even 30% black, you're talking about something like 5 million. In other words, then, you have 4 to 5 million more whites on welfare than blacks. Why is there a higher percentage of blacks on welfare? Because there are a higher percentage of poor black folk on welfare. It's no big mystery. If poverty is one of the things that qualifies one to receive welfare, then the groups that have a higher percentage of poverty-stricken people will have a higher percentage of people there. It has little to do with the kind of stuff we hear every day about attitudes and people wanting to stay on to have babies and all that other kind of nonsense. As a matter of fact, when you actually look at the average number of children per welfare mother and compare them with the average number of children per mother not on welfare, I think you'd be quite surprised to find out that that average is not very different, you see. But myths are hard to put down. When we talk about welfare, you have to start in the 1600s, not in the 1900s, not in the 20th century, but in some place like 1605, 1650, and you have to start in Europe. Welfare in its present form essentially was shaped in the 1600s in France and England and Europe. So if you want to study the history of welfare, you don't study the history of black folk on welfare, you study the history of white folk on welfare, and you study the history of welfare in Europe and study it as it was translated to America to get rid of the mythologies. And one of the important things you study, if you study the history of welfare, is to look at its political function. Welfare was not and is not only designed to meet the needs of the poor. To a great extent, we find that welfare was designed to regulate the behavior of the poor and to regulate the economic system, so that when the economic system was going through, I'm speaking now in Europe, when Europe moved from what we call feudalism, or from where the great percentage of people were involved in farming and involved in agriculture and moving over into an industrial state, there was a great deal of what we call dislocation. That is, people without jobs, people without homes, because there was a transition taking place between farm work and industrial work. And in that transition, many people lost their farms, they lost their roles on the farm, and unless industrial jobs were available, they literally were left to beg. Often, though, they just did not beg or walk around and beg people to feed them. They became dangerous. They would often protest. They would disturb the peace and cause various other civic disturbances. And it was at the point where the civic disturbances became intolerable that the state of France, England, the cities in France and so forth, decided then to establish what we call welfare programs. In other words, often the welfare programs were created and administered more to control the politics, more to control order, than actually to feed the poor or to meet the needs of the poor. Often welfare was extended during high periods of unemployment or during periods when the nature of the economy was moving from one level of technology to another level, when people then were unemployed and had to be retrained and re-educated in order to operate in the new level of technology. And therefore welfare would be brought in to sort of to help them over the transition. But when the transition was over, welfare then would be reduced. So you would have an expansion or contraction of welfare, an expansion or contraction of help from the state related to the political nature of what was going on in the state. Essentially then, the function of welfare was to regulate the behavior of the poor. If they started getting too outrageous in their behavior, if they started to threaten law and order and so forth, then the dole was expanded. But at the point where law and order could be maintained by other means, the dole was